In this video, we are going to talk about constructors in Java. So a constructor is a special type of method, and that method is called when you create an object. If you haven't watched the chapter 5, lecture materials about classes and then creating objects from classes, then you really need to go back and watch that. Okay. So in chapter 5, we did use constructors, but we really didn't talk about it too much. But the constructors are there, even though we didn't specifically see them. What we're going to talk about in this chapter is creating your own constructors. Java will give a constructor for every class that you make. So they've kind of been there behind the scenes, and it wasn't really apparent what was going on there. So what the purpose of the constructor is, right? It usually initializes the fields when an object is created. So remember, what are fields? Those are those data variables that are up at the top of a class, and those type of classes usually are representing real world objects. Last time we made a contact class in chapter 5, it had two fields, right? The name and the a number field. And we noticed that when we created an object back in chapter 5, those were empty. There was null values in there, which is essentially nothing. Okay, and and then what we had to do in chapter 5 was use the set methods to put values into those fields. So what a constructor will do most of the time, what we want it to do, is to sort of do that process right up front at the time that the object is created. In other words, the constructor we'll see is going to require some values be put in those fields, and so they'll have some values already in there. Okay, so that's the main job of the constructor. It usually initializes the fields when you create an object, so puts an initial value into those fields. All right, if you do not write a constructor for your class specifically, and that has been the case with every problem or every program that we have written so far, we did not explicitly put our own constructor in there. So when you don't do that, Java automatically provides one for you, and that automatically supplied constructor is called the default constructor. You won't even see it because it's not in there, but Java will go ahead and put one in there for you. Okay, so that is the one that we've been using. The constructor that we've been using this entire time is the default constructor. Okay, and so what we're going to do is start adding our own constructors in there. Those constructors that we add in there, they have a couple of rules that we'll have to go by exactly. Okay, so every constructor that you make for your classes has to have exactly the same name as the name of the class. Whatever the name of the class is, that's the name of the constructor. So constructors are going to be about the only methods that should start with a capital letter, right? One of the conventions in Java is to start method names rather with lowercase letters always, and start class names and only class names with uppercase letters. But with a constructor, that rule is broken because this rule sort of overrides that. A constructor has to have the same name as the name of the class, so therefore it has to start with a capital letter, just like every Java class should as well. Okay. And then the other situation that we have, the other rule that we have for constructors, is that constructors do not have a return type. And they are the only method that does not have a return type. Okay? So we've got to keep those two things in mind. All right, so here's our first example of a constructor. The constructor is right here. Okay? So here's the constructor. We have a class called student, and the student class has three fields: a field called last name, a field called first name, and a field called student ID. All right. So when we add a constructor in there, the things that we talked about, constructors are usually public. Okay. If you make your constructor private, that means that no outside class can create an object from that class, and that since classes like this that represent real world objects, since they are essentially meant to be used by another class, an outside class, that kind of defeats the purpose. So it's public here. There is no return type. So you can see it goes straight from the modifier right here, public, to the name of this method, the name of the constructor. The rule we said is that the constructor, right, has to have exactly the same name as the name of the class. So those have to match exactly. And there is no return type in between here. So a really bad mistake is to put void in here, because then Java will not see this as a constructor. So it needs to be public and then the name of the class. Okay, the constructor is a method, and so therefore it has some parentheses after the name, and then it has a parameter list, just like every other method. Okay. Generally, when you are making these constructors, and now this is not going to be a hard and fast rule, but when you're first starting off writing this, generally what you want is that for every field, right, that you have a parameter corresponding to that field. Okay, so last name field up here has a parameter last name in the constructor. The first name field has a parameter here, and the student ID field has a student ID parameter in the constructor. And that's because, again, the fundamental job of the constructor is to put values into these fields. Okay, so what that does is it prevents outside classes from creating a blank student object. It forces the outside class to give some information that we're going to put in these fields. So if you remember back in the chapter 5 video, when we were creating those objects, those contact objects, we had null values in these fields. So this would prevent that from happening. There has to be a string for last name, string first name, or a student ID object to get these things set up. All right, and then this code is sort of the bare minimum code that you would need in a constructor. And so what we're doing here, you might notice that these are a lot like the code that are in the set methods for these fields. Okay, so, and that's exactly what happens here. Whatever parameter comes in for last name, value that comes into the parameter last name is going to be copied to this field. And here again, we're using the this reference, right? And the this reference, again, is to help Java understand what is the difference between the parameter last name, this parameter in this constructor, and this field called last name. Whenever you put this dot right in front of the variable name, it is looking specifically for a field up here. So Java will not get confused about which last name you are referring to. Are you referring to this one, or are you referring to this one? When you put this dot, Java knows you are referring to the field up here. Okay? All right, so that's kind of what a constructor would look like. We have been using some constructor method calls all along. Scanner this is the code when we were creating a scanner object, and here is the constructor, right? The call to the constructor right here. So scanner, because it has the same name as the name of the class, this was actually a method call to the constructor for the scanner class, and we were giving it one argument, which is system.in, which for most of us is the keyboard, right? System.in. So this basically sets up a scanner object that is watching the keyboard for key presses that you type in. In chapter 5, when we were creating contact objects, this is a call to the constructor here. So we were calling the constructor contact. You might remember, right, we did not put a specific constructor in the code, right, for the contact class. So that's the default constructor that Java puts in there. And it has no parameters. so you don't give it any arguments when you're using the default constructor. Okay. And this is one from the Chapter 5 practice problems where we were creating circle objects. All right, let's take a look at how this would work. In the lecture code, I have an example, dog.java and testdog.java. So let's take a look at dog. So this is a class you might, if you're writing a class for some software that a veterinarian's office uses to keep track of their records, you might have a class called dog in there. All right, and so some things that you would want to keep track of about the dogs is their name, what breed they are, how old they are, and probably a bunch of other things, right? Okay. But we'll just stick with these three for the example. So here is our constructor. Again, it's public. There's no return type. So don't, you notice how on these other methods you have void in there. So you can't have that, or you don't want to put that in your constructor. There's no return type. The name of the constructor is exactly the same name as the class name. It has to be exact. And then there are three parameters, right? Name, breed, and age, right? That correspond to these fields up here, name, breed, and age. And then what we do is whatever values come into the parameters, then we set those up in the code and the method body for the constructor. We copy whatever value comes into this parameter up to this dot name, which remember refers to the field up here. So whatever comes into this variable breed will be copied up to the field breed. Whatever comes into this parameter age will be copied up to the field age, which is here, this dot age. Okay, so there's the constructor. The other stuff here, I have a speak method just to give you an example of a method that's in a class that's not a get or set method. Down here below, I have the get and set methods for all of the fields. Okay. All right, so now I am going to take a look at this class called testdog. In this class testdog, we create two dog objects. Okay. So the main difference that you should see here between your Chapter 5 practice problems and examples is that now there are some values that are inside the call to the constructor, and that is because, right, if I compile this and run it, just so you can verify that it works. Okay, so it works. If I try to do like I did in Chapter 5, right? In Chapter 5, we were calling the constructors like this because every single one of those used the default constructor, right? If I try to do that here with this example, I'm going to get this error. Constructor dog and class dog cannot be applied to the given types. So what Java is saying here is that, hey, you asked me on line 6 to create a dog object, but you didn't put anything in parentheses. And when I go over here, the only constructor that I can find is this one, and this one has 3 parameters, right? So Java says, I need to know what the name is, I need to know what the breed is, and I need to know what the age is, okay? So that's a huge difference from how it was going before. Before, in Chapter 5, we could just create an empty dog object with a bunch of blanks in there. We were creating contact objects with a bunch of blanks in there. But now when you put the constructor in there, it requires some information up front, okay? And so we would have to do like we did down here and put some names. So we would have to give it a name, we would have to give it a breed, and we would have to give it an age. And now you can see that it will work. Okay. So now Java says, oh, okay, I can see how this will work. All right, we're going to hit run this through Canvas and take a look at it. All right, let's do it that way. Okay, so here we go, and I'm going to use the curvy arrow to step through with more details. So here I am creating a dog object, right? So what's going to happen, right, when we create this object, we're going to see that it's going to bounce on over to dog.java into the constructor. All right, and so here you can see we're in class dog, we're in the constructor, right, and we can see the values that got passed to it. The values were Bill for the name, lab for breed, and 9 for the age. Okay, so what happens now is that those values get copied up to these fields. Okay, I'm not going to be able to see that great. So all those things got set up, and now we are back in test dog because that method ended, the constructor ended. And there's our dog object created. And the biggest difference, right, is that now we can see that we have some values in there. There's not these null values that we had before. So again, this is a lot better way to create your objects because you know as the programmer that some value has been set up in these fields. Whereas the other way, right, the way we were doing in chapter 5 is not as good because an outside program can create a blank object and then you will not really know as the programmer, did those fields get set up or are they null values? We'll see a lot later in the class that having null values in there will cause all kinds of problems later on if we're not careful about that. Okay. All right, and just do another one. So here I'm creating another dog object. In this case, we passed in, oops, I don't want to mess that up. So we passed in Rover and Mutt and then 3 for the age. And so you can see that all those values are now getting copied up into those fields. And my dog object is now set up with values already in there. So a big difference from chapter 5. In chapter 6, with the constructor, you are requiring information at the time of object creation. Whereas in chapter 5, that information can come later. Now, some people say, or ask the question, okay, well, I see that how that works. Why should I have these set and get methods in there? What's their purpose? We were using those before. Why should they be in there now? Well, the set methods will allow you to change these values after the object has been created, if you want to. I'm going to ask you to write these get and set methods in your programs because I want you to practice writing those things. But there are some cases where you don't want these set methods in there. Okay, if you don't want the user or some outside class to change those values after you get your object set up, then you just wouldn't have those in there. And there are cases where that is what you want to do. Okay. All right, and that gets our third dog object set up. Okay. All right, so that is what the constructor does. Its main purpose is to get get values and into the object and get those set up at the time that the object is created. That's incredibly useful, right? Because now you know, okay, there's some values that are in those. It's not set up improperly, which could cause problems in your program later. Okay. All right, I'm just going to run through here and do that. All right, so let's take a look, and I think, okay, and I'm going to separate this out into another video. So that's it for this one.